Hades was officially released with version 1.0 on September 17, 2020, and it exploded in popularity, receiving well-deserved praise from consumers and critics alike. It was recognized by several gaming outlets including IGN as Game of the Year and won many awards including Best Game from the British Academy Games Awards and Game of the Year from DICE. For an independently developed game in what was once such a niche genre to get such recognition in mainstream outlets is incredible, and in my opinion, it's evidence towards a significant shift in the indie development scene, the games industry as a whole, and in the roguelite genre. You might be confused wondering what even is a roguelite or a roguelike, or what's so great about Hades. I mean, it doesn't even have guns? It doesn't even have John Wick? Rogue is an old game that had so much influence it spawned a whole genre, the fans of which incessantly argue about semantics of definitions, and to that end we have the one-letter distinction between roguelike and roguelite. In Hades' wonderfully animated launch trailer, it's introduced as a godlike roguelike, but that's a matter of debate. Pardon my briefness, we'll get more into it later. This is a long video because Hades is only the latest chapter in the long and complicated saga of these genres. And great as it is, it's not a perfect emblem bearer for Rogue's namesake. Hades isn't alone in this. The tag roguelike is getting a lot of attention thanks to other upcoming or recent releases like Returnal and Deathloop, but this is at the dismay of the roguelike communities on the internet, who care deeply about the purity of the genre they love so much. We need to look at history to fully understand why the dismay of these gamers is important, but first off, let's focus on the positives. Here are the reasons why Hades is so darn good. Anyone who looks at the two words roguelike and roguelite side by side will probably think, hey, it's just a one-letter difference, what's the big deal? But trust me when I say that there is a tiny corner of the internet where you will be banned if you misidentify a game as a roguelike when it's really a roguelite. So here's the gist. In 1980, God programmed an ASCII game called Rogue on the caveman walls, and the popularity of the game led developers to create their own versions, and the term roguelike was born. The original roguelike community on the internet is very passionate and dedicated to the genre. They're like a commune of ancient dark wizards. They have always been here and they will always be here, lurking in the shadows. If we look at the roguelike tag on Steam, we can see that in the past decade or so, the genre has been growing in popularity. These are all games that I would consider part of this new wave. But although Hades and many of these other games are advertised as roguelikes, it's a matter of debate whether or not these games are like Rogue enough to be considered a roguelike. And so the term roguelite was born, reserved for games that share some of the core features of Rogue, but are simply too different to share the same classification as its predecessors. But a lot of people, fans and developers alike, don't use the label roguelite, finding it unnecessary and confusing. We are getting a little ahead of ourselves, I'll get more into it later, but here's what you need to know for now. The primary elements shared across both roguelikes and roguelites are procedurally generated levels, permadeath, and an emphasis on randomized mechanics. What this means is the game doesn't have a single and linear progression line. It's broken up into runs that don't require long-term investment, only short bursts of attention, in Hades' case probably at most around 30 minutes long. And in each run you'll find that the levels, enemies, and obstacles ahead of you are different every time. At the risk of oversimplification, procedural generation is like a big bin of toys, and every run the game grabs a random handful of toys to play with. While this in the short duration of runs is great for the incredibly short modern attention span, it also comes with the shortcoming that few of these games are very story-rich. Your character is traversed in the same locales over and over again, and by the very nature that each run is a fresh start, it's hard to reconcile the game's mechanics with a story in a way that makes sense. Rogue Legacy managed to make the repetitive nature of its genre make sense within the game's lore, staying true to the idea that when your character dies, they're dead for good, but their bloodline lives on. You play as their descendant in the next run. This is a clever way of justifying game mechanics, but Rogue Legacy still lacked an overarching storyline with recognizable characters. In the aspect of compelling storytelling, where these other games have failed, Hades is exemplary. This is you. You are Zagreus, the not technically historically accurate son of Hades. I don't intend to spoil the story, but the basic premise is that you hate your dad and you're attempting to escape the underworld through Tartarus, Asphodel, Elysium, and the Temple of Styx to reach the surface. You are immortal, so when you die, you get sent back to the House of Hades where you'll have to try all over again. In this way, like Rogue Legacy, the core mechanics of the game fit within the lore. The House of Hades is where you prepare for your next run and engage in fully voice-acted conversations with the house's wacky cast of characters, your grumpy old dad, your mentor, Achilles, Nyx, Thanatos, and more. Then, during your runs, your main method of attaining power is by receiving aid from the gods on Olympus: Zeus, Ares, Aphrodite, Athena, Dionysus, and more. And the most brilliant thing about this cast of characters is that they're all pre-established and well-known characters from Greek mythology, and everyone loves Greek mythology, so you come into this game already with some investment and care for the characters. This isn't the only way that Hades' story is made to be more accessible. The amazing portrait art definitely helps, and oh, by the way, did I mention all the dialogue is completely, fully voice acted?
Secretly, you're one of my best mates. Want you to know.
And there's a dating sim-like relationship system where you can give gifts and become closer with most of the major characters in the game, opening avenues to even more unique interactions. With all of these conversations paired with the main storyline, there's a whopping 21,020 or so voice lines in the game. Wow, this is an unprecedented degree of production value and attention put into establishing characters and stories compared to other similar games. And it works so well. I've put in about 80 hours and I honestly can't distinctly remember hearing duplicate voice lines more than a couple times. Even if you die, you are compelled by the fact that the story continues and your relationships with the characters continue to morph. Making friends impacts the gameplay too through acquiring keepsakes. There's one for every character who you can develop a relationship with. These, along with several weapons in the House of Hades to choose from, are how you can strategize and customize your runs. The combat is lightning fast if you want it to be. You're dashing through and killing room after room of underworld baddies and bosses and getting random power-ups and killing your dad, and oh, it is just a blast. I mentioned the story being made accessible by having a cast of recognizable characters, great art, and great voices. New players will be glad to also find that this accessibility extends to the gameplay, being simple enough, easy to pick up, and super satisfying. This is also thanks to great visual effects and sound design. The new player experience in Hades is bounds ahead of any of the other many roguelite titles that I've played, so that, along with the story, I wanted to especially highlight. There are more gameplay details to touch on, but for now, Supergiant Games is a solid development team with a good track record of games, busting out into the scene with their first title, Bastion, released onto the Xbox Live Arcade in July of 2011, which is where I first played it as a very little child. Later was Transistor in 2014, Pyre in 2017, and then finally Hades in 2020. All of their games are very critically acclaimed, and they all share some features and mechanics that you can notice if you've played Supergiant's whole catalog, how certain features evolve. Like, for example, I picked up the action mechanics of Hades super fast because they bear a resemblance to Bastion and Transistor, both of which I've played. Of course, they all play in their unique ways with their own gimmicks, but they all share this similar isometric visual style and camera angle and snappiness to the movement. I need to admit that I never got around to buying and playing Pyre. It seems to be a bit of a black sheep among the other Supergiant games because of the gameplay mechanics are wildly different. Overall, it's gotten the least recognition out of all of Supergiant's games, but despite that, it's still regarded as an incredible game, with maybe its biggest misstep being that the uniqueness of its core gameplay loop was intimidating to new players. And Supergiant made up for the accessibility issues by making Hades easy to understand and compelling right from the beginning. That's the thing with these developers, they've never really missed, and it seems like with every game they're learning from their shortcomings, and Hades is a wonderful culmination of all the work the team has put into their games. Their style and action mechanics feel right at home in the roguelite genre. And lastly, Supergiant Games deserves to be celebrated for their focus on healthy working conditions for their developers. The issue of crunch time leading up to AAA game releases and abused developers has been especially trendy as of late, and it's especially disheartening hearing stories of crunch time because there's a huge percentage of people who react to these stories by justifying it, saying so long as the game is fun, or it's just how the industry works. Supergiant Games is a shining example that proves those people wrong. A veteran designer on the team, Greg Casavin, says, It takes our existing interest in having a production discipline and makes us really refine that even more, because if your milestone schedule involves crunching every milestone, your whole production process is broken. Not only is an individual game development a marathon and not a sprint, but our whole journey is a sort of mega marathon where our success criteria for a given game is that we get to live another day and make another game after that. So considering everything, in short,
the game is fun.
Game of the Year, according to me and many other people and outlets. I especially recommend it if you have daddy issues. So what's the problem? What else is there to say? Why is there X minutes left in the video? Well, it's one thing to talk about and appreciate Hades in a vacuum, but I also think that to fully appreciate it, people should consider the bigger picture surrounding the game, its influences, inspirations, and predecessors. In my video Seeing Hollow Knight as a Souls-like, I made the simple assertion that a game is a Souls-like simply if it is similar enough to games from the Souls series, and we can approach the roguelike genre in just about the same way if we choose. The thing with these tags, Souls-like and roguelike, is that they're not very descriptive to the uninitiated, to those who don't have prior knowledge. First-person shooter is objective and descriptive. There's usually very little gray area, either it's an FPS or it's not, but that's not the case with roguelike, so we need to take a deeper dive to figure out the essence of games like Hades, and whether or not it being advertised as roguelike is accurate. So without further ado, Rogue is a randomized top-down, turn-based, grid-based, text-based RPG dungeon crawler with permadeath. I mentioned earlier that it was developed by God on the caveman walls, but that was a lie. It was actually developed for the Unix operating system in 1980 by Michael Toy, Glenn Wickman, and Ken Arnold, the progenitors of the roguelike genre. Obviously the term roguelike didn't exist at the time of Rogue's release, so I figure that in all likelihood it was just referred to as a dungeon crawler RPG. But this was a revolutionary, cutting-edge piece of game design for its time. Your disgusting zoomer brain might be looking at these letters and symbols on the screen and thinking, this was cutting edge? Where's the NVIDIA RTX ray tracing? Where's the Ender Dragon? Well, of course, this was back in 1980, and it was a tumultuous time for the games industry. The concept of owning a home console was in a bit of a slump, and it seemed like arcade cabinets were going to be the primary delivery system for virtual entertainment. But on the horizon, a less commercialized avenue for playing games was on the rise. Computer programming languages were becoming more popular and accessible, opening up game creation to a larger base of amateur users. To clarify, the personal computer did not yet exist, at least not in a form that was powerful enough to play games. Computer games from this era were being developed on mainframe computers, huge and towering modern miracles of processing. These mostly existed in institutions that could afford them, like universities. They were very powerful but came with some limitations. Without getting too much into the technicality of it, the terminals connected to the mainframe were only capable of displaying character-based graphics, and due to having to share computing resources across many terminals, these systems lacked the processing power and memory to update game elements in real time. This meant that fast-paced real-time gameplay was reserved for arcade cabinets where racing and target shooting genres thrived, and on the mainframe, programmers focused instead on strategy and puzzle-solving mechanics rather than action. And you might be asking yourself, what the heck? I thought we were here to talk about Rogue, not all of this computer mumbo-jumbo. But you see, it's important to acknowledge the limitations of these computers because it's from these limitations that Rogue was born, and its design is tightly connected to the lack of capability for real-time action on these mainframe computers. So with that in mind, I think it's finally time to talk about the gameplay of Rogue. One of the most significant games that was developed in the period of mainframe computers leading up to Rogue was a text-based adventure game called Colossal Cave Adventure by Will Crowther and Don Woods. If the developers of Rogue are like the Grecian gods, the developers of Colossal Cave Adventure are like the Grecian titans. And what I mean to say by that is that Rogue would not exist if it weren't for these two guys. And honestly, so many gaming tropes, specifically within the RPG and adventure genres, can be traced back to this game. It is widely considered considered the first work of interactive fiction, where the player can input text commands to influence the game's world, characters, and story. It is also the first example of a long line of games that feature the player character exploring and descending further into a cave or dungeon, a concept that inspired Rogue's core gameplay and that is commonly seen in the roguelike genre today. Even Hades plays with this trope by quite literally turning it on its head. Instead of descending into a dungeon as is so common in the genre, Zagreus ascends from the house of Hades to the surface. I would also credit Colossal Cave Adventure for the general popularity of several high fantasy elements that are common in games, with the interactive story largely being influenced by the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and the tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons. Rogue's developers intended to take the core concept of Colossal Cave Adventure and combine it with the gameplay mechanics of D&D, including dice rolling, turn-based fighting, and spatial positioning in a grid-based game world. Probably the most shocking thing about Rogue is the fact that it actually holds up pretty well from a mechanical standpoint, so it's no wonder that it has a dedicated fanbase still playing it to this day. In the description of this video, there's a link for Rogue Central, a comprehensive site with all of the information you need to learn about and play Rogue, including options for playing it in browser. My personal favorite way to play has been this version, JS Rogue, which has the benefit of having some sprites to replace the ASCII graphics. This is you. You are quested with traveling throughout the randomly generated dungeon map, finding scrolls and potions, fighting monsters, and growing in power in hopes to reach the bottom of the dungeon to acquire the Amulet of Yendor. Beware of centaurs, dragons, orcs, zombies, and more. I guess if you're looking for something with a little more frills, Rogue's story might fall a little flat for you, but it's an RPG, baby. Story doesn't matter. The highlight here, the thing to praise more than anything else, is the highly tactical gameplay. It's all completely turn-based and there's no incentive to go any faster than you desire, so you can take your time and familiarize yourself with the intimidating list of controls. Once you get comfortable and identify which keys are used most often, like for example the keys for switching your equipped weapon or drinking potions, it's easy to get into a groove, and it can be satisfying to traverse Rogue's dungeons with ease, not having to check the command list obsessively like you might when you first start playing. Oh, there's an enemy in the distance. Time to switch equipment, select your bow, select your arrows, and fire away, all in an easy string of 6 to 7 keystrokes. Wow! Luckily, you can press A to repeat your last action, so you can spam arrows and repeat other actions if need be. And then when you're out of arrows, you can start mindlessly running into enemies until you die. That's probably how your first run will end. And due to the nature of permadeath, you'll find yourself right back at the start of the dungeon, but fear not. The dungeon is different this time around, and you can learn from your mistakes. And herein lies the spirit of Rogue and games like it. Yes, you will die and lose all of your hard work and progress. But when you invest yourself into your runs, you notice little things to improve about your strategy with every failure. You're equipped with more knowledge, and if you keep at it, you will eventually become a master of the game's core systems. That level of mastery is something I never reached in Rogue. I want to beat it someday soon, but at least for the time being, I've given up. I had a satisfying time with the game even 40 years after its release. It felt like exploring the roots of certain mechanics that I've come to love so much in games over the years. My first experience playing a game with permadeath and randomized mechanics was The Binding of Isaac, released in 2011 by Edmund Macmillan. For such a gory and weird game, I played this when I was far too young, probably, but I wasn't paying so much attention to the biblical imagery and baby corpses. I was falling in love with the same spirit of gameplay that's also in Rogue. I was spending hours trying to maximize advantage from the game's systems, finding fun in things like walking back and forth from an arcade room to a blood donation machine and getting max money, and learning more with every death. But even this game, which I hold to such a high standard for nostalgia's sake, I have to say it's not very much like Rogue. And then I look even more ahead, I look at Hades, and you know, this game is astronomically different than Rogue. You can tell that there are influences, but above all else, I look at Rogue and the games that are so often referred to as roguelikes back to back, and all I can think is, when did things get so fucky? What the fuck is a roguelike? By fucky here, I mean the terms roguelike and roguelite are just so frustratingly and confusingly similar to each other, and above all else, it's bad for the consumer and bad for the accessibility of the genres for there to be all of this confusion. There's incessant arguing online, and when the average Joe visits the Steam store page for Hades, they're gonna see both of these tags side by side and wonder what the difference is, and upon further exploration, they'll find that a lot of the same titles appear in both categories. More often than not, people see this overlap and come to the conclusion that the division between roguelike and roguelite is essentially meaningless, and that anyone who cares about the semantics of these classifications is being a little unreasonable. And while maybe that's true, I want to try my best to convince those people that this divide exists for a reason. The easiest way to do that, I think, is to look at history. How did we get from here to here? Well, there's a long list of 40 years worth of games to consider to get the full picture, but we'll be brief and look at the big players, the games that were innovative and set into motion major changes for the genre. Imagine the growth of Rogue's successors like a tree. At its base, of course, is Rogue, and all roguelikes branch off from there. Moria takes place in the world of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, in the Mines of Moria, where the player must descend and defeat the Balrog. It was one of the earliest clones of Rogue, with the major innovation being the addition of a town level, wherein the player can buy gear and items to help them on their journey. Hack is widely considered as a generally improved version of the original Rogue, similar in many ways but with huge additions including many character classes to choose from, shops, and a dog. Larn widely expanded Rogue's core idea of dungeon delving by featuring multiple dungeons for the player to explore, all connected by a persistent town with a multitude of locales to buy, sell, store valuables, and more. These we can consider a non-comprehensive list of the first generation of roguelikes, directly inspired by Rogue and improving on its gameplay in various ways. Things went on like this for a while. New roguelikes would take direct inspiration from the previous generation and expound upon mechanics and add more content. For example, Hack turned into NetHack and Moria turned into Angband, both of which are part of the second generation of major roguelikes. This generational approach to categorizing roguelikes is pretty widely accepted by internet communities, and depending on how comprehensively you want to visualize the tree of influences, things can get a little wacky. All of these classic roguelikes are of course distinct to a certain degree, but also fairly homogeneous in that they share the same core DNA from Rogue. A few particular games released around the turn of the millennium championed the beginning of a drastic turn in the genre, and in game design as a whole, the first of which chronologically is Diablo. Most people will think of Diablo as a progenitor in its own right, having directly inspired many dungeon crawlers for many years to come after its release in 1997, but you might be surprised to hear that the developers have cited inspiration from the roguelike genre. Their initial pitch, in a nutshell, was to take the excitement and randomness of games like Moria, NetHack, and Rogue and bring them into the 1990s with fantastic graphics and sound. And they even mention how the game was initially turn-based until the decision was made to shift towards real-time action. This article I'm reading from was written in 1998, and it describes Diablo as suffering from a genre confusion. But today, the core framework of Diablo feels more like the status quo for its genre, spawning several hack-and-slash action RPGs that all play fairly similarly. Diablo was a great game in 1997 because a team of great developers looked at the Rogue-inspired elements of game design and asked, what if it was more action-oriented? This kind of genre mixing led to the continued mutation of the roguelike genre and brought a new term into the lexicon of people discussing roguelikes on the internet and at conventions, the roguelite. This mutation started as early as the years surrounding Diablo's release and was slow and gradual, but the term roguelite itself began to become increasingly relevant during the huge explosion of roguelite titles following the release of Spelunky by Derek Yu in 2008. Just as Diablo was the result of asking, what if we put real-time action in a roguelike, Spelunky was the result of asking, what if we put platforming in a roguelike? You are an adventurer, delving into procedurally generated levels, managing resources, and proceeding carefully because if you die, it means starting from the beginning. It shares these core principles with roguelikes, but of course, the gameplay mechanics differ entirely. There are things that frustrated me about platform games, and there were things that frustrated me about roguelike games, says Derek Yu. I wanted to see if I could rub out the bad parts and just keep the good parts of those genres. This is a simple enough idea at its core, but up until this point there hadn't been a stark and popularized attempt to mix genres with roguelikes, so Spelunky was extraordinary. Other developers took note, Spelunky made huge waves, and several other roguelite titles would follow after its initial release in 2008, and especially after the release of the Xbox 360 version in 2012. Edmund Macmillan played Spelunky and would go on to describe it as the best indie game ever made. As a designer, it's one of the most influential and inspiring games that I've played in forever. His contribution to the roguelite genre was the result of asking, what if we put gameplay elements from The Legend of Zelda in a roguelike? We've got the rhythm game with roguelike mechanics, the card game, match 4 puzzle game, first-person shooter, 2D Dark Souls, and of course, good old Supergiant top-down isometric action. The creators of FTL Faster Than Light, Justin Ma and Matthew Davis, described it well in saying, Spelunky showed us that you can distill some of the intensity found in roguelikes and combine it with other genres. And this approach is so widely variable that it still seems like a few times a year a creative developer will come out with a fresh new idea for the application of mechanics that date back to 1980. Loop Hero is a recent example of this, a roguelite release that blew the notion of genre completely out of the water, being something in between an idle game, card game, tower defense, base builder, and roguelite. It's so gratifying being a fan and follower of this genre because I find myself constantly impressed and surprised by game design, and I believe that the best examples of this creative design have yet to be developed even. It seems like with Hades getting the huge recognition it got, and with other recent releases, we are seeing the advent of a kind of golden age of roguelites. AAA developers will see the success of games like Hades and it might lead them to put more money into a roguelite title that otherwise might have been too risky to fund. And on top of that, indie developers are pumping out roguelite and roguelike titles stupid fast. It turns out that procedural generation is an easy way to make a game that reuses a lot of assets and has a lot of replayability, so it's perfect for smaller development teams. So, using the response to Hades as evidence, my prediction is that we're going to start seeing more developers following this trend in the coming years, and it's going to be great. I'm a fan of roguelites, but I'm also a fan of roguelikes, and as an avid fan of both, I feel the need to do whatever I can to protect the division between the two. This and this are both great, but for entirely different reasons. There's a certain attitude that I came across in my research for this video that the recent wave of roguelites is an evolution of the roguelike genre, and people who feel this way look at anything top-down and or text-based, the classic roguelikes, and find them to be antiquated. This is unfair. I'll submit that roguelites are more accessible and appealing to general audiences, but that same general audience will tend to call everything that has procedural generation, permadeath, and randomized mechanics a roguelike. It feels a little like an erasure of a rich history and still ongoing vibrant community that is centered around the development and discussion of classic roguelike titles. They've got forums and message boards, podcasts, a big international presence, and active conventions where game creators share their craft. In 2008, a group assembled at one of these conventions, the International Roguelike Development Conference in Germany, to try and settle on a common and strict definition of roguelike. The attendees gathered, much like a council of dark wizards, and agreed upon what is now called the Berlin interpretation. The idea was to reach a definition that is representative of the genre's canon, namely rogue, nethack, crawl, angband, and atom. It consists of a list of high-value and low-value factors based on the mechanics in these games: random environment generation, permadeath, turn-based, grid-based, non-modal, complexity, resource management, hack and slash, exploration and discovery, single-player character, monsters are similar to players, tactical challenge, ASCII display, dungeons, and numbers. The existence of the Berlin interpretation should be a shining example of the extreme extents to which this community cares about the purity of the roguelike genre. To me, it tells a story of a group of people who appreciate an art form that is continually being seen by mainstream outlets as outdated. Meanwhile, as roguelites continued to be developed, they became increasingly less bound to the notion of a traditional roguelike, and one symptom of that is more focus on graphical fidelity by roguelite developers. Hades, for example, is a good-looking game, on par with a lot of other popular recent releases, even those with a lot more money put into them. The point is, Hades and other roguelites pride themselves on having distinct visual styles, far from the classic roguelike style. But trust me when I say that when you get accustomed to this, This starts to feel visually loud and distracting. The thing about roguelikes is that the graphics never get in the way of the gameplay, ideally. Everything happens immediately, turns pass simultaneously with your actions with no flashy animations to watch. You need to take the time to learn the visual language of the game and commit the controls to muscle memory, and it's at that point that all of the pieces start to fall into place. You come to realize that the core of the game is pure, unfiltered, undistracted, critical thinking. Each element of the Berlin interpretation, especially the high value factors, contribute to this. You make a decision, act upon it, scan the screen for your next move, and repeat. When you enter this flow state, the graphics are of little concern to you. In contrast, Hades will stop to let you admire its world, develop its characters, and otherwise stop this flow of decision making. The art of Hades is worth admiring, but there's an artfulness in Rogue's simplicity and focus on gameplay too. ASCII display is listed as a low value factor by the Berlin interpretation, so some roguelikes manage to look interesting and unique while still sticking to the high value factors. But listed among those are turn-based and grid-based, which ends up guiding both the gameplay and the visual style. There's only so much you can do within a grid. Whether or not developers decide to confine themselves to this grid, the most important thing to keep in mind is that these different approaches to game design are different, and not necessarily better or worse. The Berlin interpretation was back in 2008, so I'm sure you're wanting to move on from ancient history and onto the present. Surely by now, video game enthusiasts have set aside their differences and stopped arguing about definitions, right? I lurk in a lot of communities where I read arguments about this kind of thing all the time, but the thing is, there are hardly ever actual, real arguments, and what I mean to say by that is usually it's more like one or both parties in the argument are confused and misguided and are just looking for answers because this shit is confusing. And frankly, the argument simply will not stop while there is so much fervent innovation by indie developers within these genres. We can see this is true by looking at how the argument has evolved through the years, with more and more games mixing genres and blurring lines. One big topic of consideration in this battle between genres is the importance of meta progression. I mentioned how Hades cheats the idea of permadeath in its story. You are immortal. Zagreus and the story both live on when you die in a run, and you return to the House of Hades. But I never directly mentioned that this has gameplay implications as well. Between runs, there are methods of permanently making Zagreus and his weapons more powerful, which has a significant impact on the difficulty of the game. There's your progression in your runs, your attempts to escape the underworld, and then there's another layer of progression outside of that, the Mirror of Night and weapon upgrades. This is meta progression. This concept isn't directly referred to in the Berlin interpretation, but in many cases it violates the high value factor of permadeath. You are not expected to win the game with your first character. You start over from the first level when you die. The random environment makes this enjoyable rather than punishing. While in Hades' case this is mostly true, you do start over at the first level every time you die. It's not quite a clean slate. Spelunky had only a very small amount of meta progression through the Tunnel Man, who would unlock shortcuts to skip the early levels. As this doesn't necessarily make your character more powerful in a way that persists between runs, I'm less confident to call Spelunky's form of meta progression a violation of the permadeath clause of the Berlin interpretation. It's not very offensive, it doesn't make the game easier, it's just convenient. It's supposed to be a crutch for players to lean on if they're struggling to beat the game all in one go starting from the first level, and a real run of Spelunky wouldn't utilize the Tunnel Man at all. There's a huge difference between something as innocuous as these early level skips and the meta progression in Hades. As Zagreus grows in power, the game becomes easier with every loss. It's very player-friendly game design. Losing doesn't feel so bad because you acquired resources during your run that you can spend to make your next run easier. And this continues and continues until eventually the game becomes significantly easier and then you win. While this progression is satisfying and fun, the risk is that victory can feel sort of unearned. If you overcome an obstacle that you previously struggled with, it wasn't just because you became a better and smarter player, it's because the game wanted you to progress and made it hard not to. Hades isn't designed to be won on your first run, it wants you to fail, so that failure also feels a little fabricated. I feel that this is why roguelike purists find misclassifying Hades as a roguelike so offensive. Fans of roguelikes tend to enjoy unforgiving games that encourage a slow building mastery that is forged through failure. Hades still has a learning curve, so that's present to some degree, but the power-ups handed to you serve to eventually make the game much easier. easier. You might recall the permadeath factor. These things are still true in Hades, but it would be disingenuous to imply that it has true permadeath like a roguelike. The difference is that your first run of Hades is mechanically stunted. You don't even start with all of the basic attacks and power-ups at your disposal. You are meant to die repeatedly to be fed more stats, damage, health, speed, etc. before reaching the final boss, and to see more story moments unfold. Rogue Legacy is a premier example of a roguelite where you unlock power much like Hades, in a very upfront and intentional way. Between runs, you spend gold obtained in the dungeon to build a castle representing the magnanimity and power of your family line. Health up, attack up, armor up, gold gain up, etc. The average player will need to build this castle to some degree to get the stats to beat the game, but in Rogue Legacy as well as in Hades, it's entirely possible to reach and defeat the final boss with the measly stats and limitations of your first run. This is difficult. It takes a skilled player, but it's difficult in a you die in one hit and every enemy takes 100 hits kind of way. In short, difficult in a not very fun way. This is far from the normal experience with the game, but the point still stands. In a game where the player character's power level shifts so much, the challenges you face are so often related to numbers. You might find yourself lamenting at an enemy having such a huge health pool, or they do far too much damage in one hit. You aren't so much at the mercy of the game's statistics in a traditional roguelike. Every run is a potential win. It's only a matter of putting your skill and knowledge of the game up against the challenges ahead of you. You still won't beat Rogue on your first run, I can guarantee that much. But losing feels alright even without an overarching second progression line. There is a type of meta progression in traditional roguelikes, but it's internal, from the player. It's your slow and gradual journey with the game, learning with every loss and achieving cathartic victory after many failures. Meta progression is one of the biggest factors contributing to the divide between roguelikes and roguelites. To reiterate from before, these are game design choices that aren't necessarily better or worse. And even between Spelunky, Hades, and Rogue Legacy, we can see how meta progression can be utilized in different ways. To that end, I can see the following types of meta progression: unlocking power, unlocking convenience, and unlocking variety. Various roguelites will tap into these different forms of meta progression to varying degrees and significantly impact the type of enjoyment garnered from the game and the difficulty. Unlocking power and unlocking convenience we've already illustrated with Hades, Rogue Legacy, and Spelunky. The third has a lot of representation. It's any roguelite that caters towards completionists, people who enjoy seeing a list of unlockables and trying to reach 100% completion. Completionists would also enjoy chasing after all of the upgrades and unlockables in Hades too, but the difference here is that unlocking variety isn't supposed to make a game expressly easier. In The Binding of Isaac, this is hugely noticeable. In my experience with the game, unlocking items sometimes even made the game harder. Some of the best items become rarer when more and more mediocre items muddle the item pool. It should be noted too that while Isaac is a good example of a game wherein you unlock variety, you also unlock direct permanent upgrades too. For example, you unlock the D6 as a starting item for Isaac after beating the cathedral with a specific character. This is unusual. Most of the unlocks are items, locations, and bosses that can potentially appear in your future runs. And the big appeal is striving towards a save file with everything unlocked, which will take reaching several different endings with all of the characters. My proclivity for this kind of system aside, I can see how roguelike purists want to distance their genre's name from this form of meta progression too. Again, progression is fun and satisfying, but there are inadvertent effects. Your skill, knowledge, and mastery of the game aren't the only things at play. There's also an inevitable end to the progression, a point where the player has unlocked everything there is to unlock. And when that wall is hit, the game will become much more stale, as it relied on those progression systems to draw you in the first place. Roguelikes make you care about the gameplay first and foremost. Everything is in service of making sure that you are playing for the sake of itself, not to unlock anything or acquire a trophy, but just to play and experience the game. Hidetaka Miyazaki said the same thing about Dark Souls. I say this at the risk of sounding like a games journalist from 5 years ago who would compare everything to Dark Souls, but there are some parallels to roguelike design in the purity of gameplay, undistracted by too much story or anything else. This specific design philosophy is admirable, but I would hate to come across as pretentiously implying that any game like Hades or The Binding of Isaac is poorly designed or bad in any way because they're more achievement focused. I've put so many hours into both of these games and many more like them, but the appeal is in no way the same as in roguelikes. This is why the Division needs so urgently to be protected, and why the Berlin interpretation is important. And maybe it sounds dramatic and strange for some people to hear something like an agreement made by nerds at a convention in Germany as important. It's strange that such a thing even exists, but there is undoubtedly something about the classic roguelikes that is extraordinary and beautiful, attracting such a vibrant and passionate following on the internet and inspiring such creative design. It's probably just about as important as something can be with regards to video games and the internet. Year after year, video games are establishing a position of normalcy in modern culture, and in tandem, games are hyper-focused on consumerism. The image of computer-obsessed college students pouring themselves into a passion project like Rogue is in stark contrast to what gaming has become today. 500 developers worked on Cyberpunk 2077, individuals receiving paychecks and being compartmentalized and managed, and at a certain point, when the development of a game is composed of so many voices, individual attempts at artistry tend to feel drowned out by the grandiosity and ambition of the overall project. The development of Hades is wonderfully chronicled on YouTube. It's insightful, breaking the facade that video games exist just for your entertainment. They're gigantic multimedia canvases. Music, writing, voices, animation, engineering, design. These things all need to come together, and when a team is small enough, these individual artists are able to be strongly collaborative, and the result is a finished piece that feels focused and beautifully polished. Hades being advertised as a roguelike was a consumerist decision. Everything about it is appealing to a wide audience. Fast, visually spectacular, fresh, and subversive. Rogue and the games that followed it are unique, widely variable in their intricacies, and mechanically impressive, but the strictness represented by the Berlin interpretation and by the grid that binds all roguelikes together is not in line with the modern view of gaming. Revel in the fact that we have both roguelikes and roguelites, and that the attention generated by Hades is also attention generated for Rogue's namesake. And roguelike communities will immovably remain on the internet, where roguelikes will always be accessible. You can also see the genre's rich history in detail, how a burgeoning form of artistic expression has been quickly changing, the natural progression of an art form growing older, and the breadth of capabilities being further explored. Celebrate what has come before, be excited to see how mechanics and genres will continue to change with the times, and above all else, stay swaggy.